The cruelest betrayals come wrapped in familiar voices, served alongside dishes you've spent days preparing. I learned this truth at 52, surrounded by the people I'd devoted my entire adult life to pleasing. What happened that Thanksgiving? Evening didn't just end my marriage. It revealed who I'd really been living with all these years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The Tuesday before Thanksgiving found me exactly where I'd been every year for the past 28 years. Elbow deep in preparation lists, grocery receipts scattered across my kitchen counter like autumn leaves. I had always been the one to host, always been the one to coordinate, plan, cook, clean, and smile through it all while everyone else showed up expecting perfection. My name is Linda, and I had perfected the art of invisible exhaustion. The kind that lives behind a smile, that powers through 14-hour cooking marathons, that never says no when asked to accommodate one more dietary restriction or last-minute guest addition. My husband Marcus used to joke that I could run a small country with the organizational skills I put into our family gatherings. He said it like a compliment, but I'd begun to hear something else in his tone lately. Something that sounded almost like dismissal. Our colonial-style house in Millbrook had become the unofficial headquarters for every family celebration. My mother-in-law Eleanor insisted it was because I was such a natural hostess, but I suspected it was more about convenience. My kitchen was the largest, my dining room could seat 24, and most importantly, I never complained about the workload. I'd trained everyone in my orbit to expect my compliance. The guest list this year had grown to 19 people. Marcus's parents, Eleanor and Frank, who drove down from Albany every holiday with Eleanor's famous and famously terrible green bean casserole that no one ate but everyone praised. My sister Jennifer and her husband Tom, plus their 3 teenagers who spent every gathering glued to their phones. My brother Paul, recently divorced, who would arrive with whatever woman he was dating that month and spend the evening making awkward conversation. Marcus's sister Dana and her family, including their twin 8-year-olds who treated my house like their personal playground. And then there were our own children. Jessica, 26, who worked in marketing in Boston and had recently become insufferably vocal about family toxicity after reading some self-help book. Our son, Andrew, 23, fresh out of college, and convinced he knew everything about everything, especially how his parents should be living their lives. Both of them had developed the infuriating habit of psychoanalyzing every family interaction, as if they were observing us through a telescope rather than living among us. I'd been preparing for this Thanksgiving the way generals prepare for battle. 3 weeks of menu planning, 2 weeks of shopping and prep work, and 1 week of deep cleaning every surface of our 4-bedroom house until it gleamed. The china had been washed and arranged, the good silverware polished until it reflected the dining room chandelier. I'd even bought new autumn-themed cloth napkins, because Eleanor had mentioned last year that paper napkins seemed casual for such a gathering. Marcus, meanwhile, had contributed exactly what he contributed every year. Nothing. Oh, he'd ask if I needed help in that vague, hopeful tone that suggested he was praying I'd say no. When I inevitably handled everything myself, he'd pat my shoulder and tell everyone what an amazing wife he had, as if his appreciation somehow balanced the scales of effort. But this year felt different. There was an undercurrent I couldn't quite identify, like the electrical charge in the air before a thunderstorm. Marcus had been taking more phone calls in his study with the door closed. He'd bought new clothes, expensive ones, without mentioning it. He'd started going to the gym again after a 5-year hiatus, claiming he wanted to get back in shape. When I'd commented on his sudden fitness enthusiasm, he'd shrugged and said something about new chapters that I'd chosen not to examine too closely. I should have examined it closely. I should have trusted the instinct that was whispering warnings I wasn't ready to hear. The morning of Thanksgiving, I was up at 5:30, just as I had been every year since we'd moved to this house. The turkey, a 22-pound monster that had barely fit in our refrigerator, needed to go into the oven by 7 if we wanted to eat at 3. I moved through my kitchen in the dark, guided by muscle memory and the soft glow of the under cabinet. Lighting Marcus had installed 2 Christmases ago. Coffee first, then the turkey prep. I'd learned to break the morning into manageable segments, like a relay race where I was the only runner. Stuff the turkey, prep the vegetables, start the eye. Cranberry sauce, check on the rolls rising in the warming drawer, each task flowing into the next with choreographed precision. Marcus appeared around 8, already dressed in the navy sweater I'd bought him specifically for today. His gray hair was carefully styled, and he was wearing the cologne I'd given him for his birthday. Cologne that usually only came out for special occasions or date nights we rarely had anymore. "Morning, beautiful," he said, kissing the top of my head as I basted the turkey. "Smells incredible in here already." I smiled automatically, the response programmed after decades of practice. "The turkey's on schedule. Could you help me move the dining room table extension?" "Of course." But he made no immediate move to help, instead pouring himself coffee and scrolling through his phone. "Actually, I need to run out for a bit. Forgot to pick up wine yesterday." This was news to me. I'd specifically asked him 3 times over the past week to handle the wine selection, and each time he'd assured me he had it covered. "We need at least 4 bottles," I called after him, but he was already grabbing his keys from the bowl by the garage door. "I'll get plenty," he called back. And then he was gone, leaving me alone with the scent of roasting turkey and a familiar knot of irritation in my stomach. This was how it always went. I'd plan every detail, assign him 1 or 2 simple tasks, and he'd either forget entirely or handle them so last minute that I'd spend the morning anxious about whether everything would come together. But it always did come together, because I made sure it did. I'd learned to build redundancies into every plan, to have backup solutions for his oversights, to smile and pretend it was all effortless. By 10 o'clock, I had the sweet potatoes, roasting, the cranberry sauce simmering, and 3 different appetizers arranged on serving platters. The dining room table looked like something from a magazine spread, complete with the autumn centerpiece I'd assembled from gourds and branches I'd collected during my weekend walks. Every detail was perfect, just as everyone expected it to be. Marcus returned with wine just as I was putting the finishing touches on the gravy, which had required 3 attempts to get the consistency right. He set 6 bottles on the counter. Expensive. Ones, I noticed, from a wine shop across town that we rarely frequented. "This should be plenty," he said, but something in his voice sounded off. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Nervous, maybe, or excited in a way that didn't match the occasion. "These are nice," I observed, reading the labels. "Special occasion wine?" He shrugged, suddenly very interested in arranging the bottles in the wine rack. "Figured we should celebrate properly." "Celebrate what?" "Just family, being together, you know." I did know, but his answer felt incomplete, like he was reading from a script he hadn't fully memorized. I'd been married to Marcus for 28 years. I knew the difference between his genuine responses and the ones he gave when he was hiding something. This was definitely the latter. But I had mashed potatoes to whip and rolls to warm, so I filed away my unease and returned to the familiar rhythm of final preparations. By 1 o'clock, the kitchen looked like a tornado had swept through it, but every dish was ready or nearly ready. The turkey was resting, golden and perfect. The side dishes were staying warm in various appliances throughout the kitchen. Even the coffee was set up for after dinner, complete with the dessert plates I'd hand-washed that morning. The first guests arrived at 2:30, my brother Paul with a woman named Cheryl who looked nervous and wore too much perfume. I welcomed them with the hostess smile I'd perfected, took their coats, and offered drinks while Marcus emerged from his study looking freshly showered and changed into yet another new shirt I didn't remember him buying. "Paul!" Marcus embraced my brother with more enthusiasm than usual. "Good to see you, man. And you must be Cheryl. Welcome to our home." I watched this interaction with growing puzzlement. Marcus was being unusually performative. Like, he was acting the role of gracious host rather than simply being one. There was an energy about him that I couldn't place, an anticipation that seemed disproportionate to a family dinner he'd attended dozens of times before. The other guests arrived in the predictable sequence: Eleanor and Frank with their casserole, and unsolicited opinions about everything from my choice of tablecloth to the temperature in the house. Jennifer and her family, with the teenagers immediately disappearing to find Wi-Fi passwords and quiet corners. Dana's family, with the twins racing through the house despite my polite requests for indoor voices. Jessica and Andrew arrived together, having met at the train station, both looking vaguely skeptical about the whole endeavor in the way that only young adults can manage. They'd reached that age where family gatherings felt more like sociological experiments than celebrations, and they approached each interaction with the detached curiosity of researchers studying a primitive culture. By 3:00, 19, people were scattered throughout our house, and the noise level had reached the familiar crescendo of competing conversations, clinking dishes, and children's voices. I moved among them like a ghost, refilling drinks, adjusting place settings, checking that everyone had what they needed while feeling increasingly invisible, despite being the center around which everything revolved. "Linda, this spread is absolutely gorgeous," Eleanor announced, though I noticed she was eyeing the placement of her green bean casserole with obvious disapproval. It was positioned toward the end of the buffet line, behind the more popular dishes, and we both knew it would remain largely untouched. "Thank you," I replied, making a mental note to serve myself a small portion of the casserole later, just to be polite. This was another invisible tax of hosting, eating things you didn't want to spare people's feelings, pretending to love dishes that had been family traditions longer than you'd been family. Marcus had positioned himself near the bar cart, playing bartender with theatrical flair, mixing cocktails and telling stories I'd heard 100 times before. But there was something different about his performance today. He kept glancing at his watch, and there was a barely contained energy about him that made me think of an actor waiting for his cue to deliver the big monologue. "Dinner's ready," I announced, and the familiar migration began. 19 people finding their assigned seats around the extended dining room table, with children relegated to a smaller table I'd set up in the adjoining family room. The good china caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, and for a moment, I allowed myself to feel proud of what I'd created. It was beautiful. It was perfect. It was also completely overwhelming, and I was exhausted before we'd even begun to eat. Marcus stood at the head of the table, wineglass in hand, as conversations gradually died down and attention turned toward him. This was tradition. Marcus always gave the Thanksgiving toast. Usually, it was something generic about gratitude and family, delivered with the casual warmth of someone who'd never had to plan a single detail of the gathering he was blessing. But tonight, as he cleared his throat and looked around the table, I noticed his hand was trembling slightly. Not from nerves exactly, but from something that looked almost like excitement, like he was about to share news he'd been dying to tell. "Before we begin this beautiful meal that my incredible wife has prepared," he began, and I felt the familiar flush of embarrassed pleasure at being acknowledged. "I want to say something important." The room fell completely silent. Even the children at the kids' table seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Marcus raised his glass higher, his eyes bright with an emotion I couldn't quite read. "This year has been one of profound change for me, of growth, of self-discovery, of finally having the courage to pursue the life I was meant to live." My stomach dropped. Those words, growth, self-discovery, courage, were the vocabulary of someone preparing to blow up their life. I'd heard similar speeches from friends' husbands shortly before divorce announcements, from colleagues who'd quit their jobs to follow their passion, from people who were about to disappoint everyone who depended on them. "So, I want to propose a toast," Marcus continued, his voice growing stronger, more confident. "To new beginnings, to the courage to choose happiness, to being authentic, even when it's difficult." He paused, his eyes scanning the table, lingering for a moment on each face before settling on mine. And in that moment, I saw something I'd been too busy, too accommodating, too willfully blind to notice before. I saw a man who had already left his marriage emotionally and was now preparing to make it official. "To a new beginning," he said, raising his glass even higher, "without the patterns and expectations that have held us back." The room was so quiet I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. "Without the roles we've outgrown," he continued, his voice gaining momentum like a train pulling away from a station. "Without the compromises that have kept us from becoming who we're really meant to be." I felt my face freeze into the hostess smile, that automatic response that had carried me through thousands of awkward social moments. But underneath the smile, something was cracking. Some foundational understanding of my life was shifting, like tectonic plates adjusting to new pressure. "Without you, Linda." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fire everyone could smell, but no one wanted to acknowledge. 19 people sat in perfect silence around my perfectly set table, surrounded by the perfect meal I'd spent days preparing, while my husband of 28 years announced that his new beginning required my absence. "Without the woman who has given me everything," he continued, as if he were eulogizing me rather than discarding me, "but who represents a chapter of my life that needs to end." I don't remember breathing during those moments. I don't remember blinking or swallowing or any of the automatic functions that keep a body alive. I only remember the sound of my own heartbeat in my ears and the strange crystalline clarity that comes when shock strips away all the comfortable illusions you've been living with. So here's to new chapters, to authentic living, and to the courage to change. He drained his wine glass in one long swallow, while 19 people stared at him in horror, confusion, and dawning understanding. The silence stretched on until it became unbearable, filled with the weight of words that couldn't be unsaid, and a life that had just been irrevocably altered. I looked around the table at faces I'd been cooking for, cleaning for, accommodating for years. Eleanor's mouth was hanging open in a most undignified way. Jennifer was staring at Marcus like he'd grown a second head. The children were looking, back and forth between the adults, sensing drama but not understanding its dimensions. And then, in that moment of perfect silence, I did something that surprised everyone in the room, including myself. I started to laugh, not the polite laugh I'd perfected for awkward social moments, but a real laugh. Deep and genuine and completely inappropriate for the situation. It started as a chuckle and grew into something that shook my shoulders and brought tears to my eyes. "Of course you were ready," I said, setting down my wine glass with careful precision. "Of course you picked Thanksgiving, the one day of the year when I've spent a week of my life making sure everything is perfect for everyone else." The laughter was still bubbling up from somewhere deep in my chest, and I couldn't seem to stop it. "You know what's funny, Marcus? You're absolutely right. This is perfect timing." I stood up slowly, smoothing down the dress I'd chosen specifically, because the burgundy color complemented the autumn table settings. Because I've been ready too. I just didn't know it until right now. 28 years of invisible exhaustion, of being taken for granted, of prioritizing everyone else's comfort over my own recognition, crystallized into perfect, liberating clarity. I'd been living in a marriage where I was appreciated like a high-end appliance, valuable for what I could produce, but not seen as a person with my own needs and desires. "I've been ready for years," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. "Ready to stop pretending that a marriage where I do everything and you show up for the applause is somehow normal. ready to stop making excuses for why I always accommodate and you always expect. Marcus's face had gone pale. This clearly wasn't the reaction he'd anticipated. I suspect he'd expected tears, pleading, maybe even a dramatic scene that would justify his decision to leave. He hadn't expected me to agree with him. "You want a new beginning without me?" I asked, looking directly at him for the first time since his toast began. "Congratulations, Marcus. You've got it." I moved around the table, collecting my purse from the sideboard where I'd placed it hours earlier when I was still operating. Under the illusion that this was going to be a normal family dinner, "Where are you going?" Eleanor finally found her voice, though it came out as more of a squeak than her usual commanding tone. "Away from here," I said simply. "I'm sure you can all figure out dinner without me. I've been doing everything else around here for long enough that the systems should be self-explanatory." I looked around the table one more time, taking in the faces of people I'd been serving and accommodating and prioritizing for years. Some looked shocked, others embarrassed. A few, like Jessica, looked almost impressed. "Enjoy your new beginning, Marcus," I said, and walked out of my own dining room, through my own kitchen, and out my own front door, leaving behind the turkey I'd basted, the sides I'd prepared, and the 28 years of marriage I'd finally realized had been over long before today. The afternoon air was crisp and clean after the overheated intensity of the house. I stood on my own front porch for a moment, breathing deeply and feeling something I hadn't experienced in years, the possibility of choice, real choice, not the illusion of choice between different ways to accommodate other people's needs. My phone was already buzzing with texts, probably from family members trying to process what had just happened. I turned it off without reading them and walked to my car, a blue Honda Civic that Marcus had always said was perfectly adequate for my needs. Another one of those dismissive comments I'd been trained not to examine too closely. As I drove away from the house where I'd hosted every family gathering for nearly 3 decades, I caught sight of myself in the rearview mirror and realized I was still smiling. Not the practiced hostess smile, but something real and genuine and entirely my own. Marcus wanted a new beginning without me. What he didn't realize was that I'd been waiting my entire adult life for permission to want the same thing. I just hadn't known I didn't need anyone's permission but my own. I drove aimlessly through the quiet streets of Millbrook, past houses where other families were probably sitting down to their own Thanksgiving dinners, blissfully unaware that someone's entire world had just shifted on its axis. The radio was playing soft jazz, and for the first time in years I actually heard the music instead of using it as background noise while mentally reviewing my endless to-do lists. My phone kept buzzing from where I'd tossed it in the passenger seat, but I ignored it. Whatever crisis was unfolding back at the house, whether people were arguing, whether dinner was getting cold, whether Marcus was trying to explain himself, none of it was my responsibility anymore. The realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. I ended up at Riverside Park, a place I'd driven past thousands of times but rarely visited. There was something poetic about sitting beside the Hudson River while my marriage dissolved behind me, watching the water flow steadily southward without any regard for the human dramas playing out along its banks. The late afternoon sun was beginning to set, painting everything in shades of gold and amber that matched my autumn table decorations perfectly. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent the morning arranging miniature pumpkins and carefully placing each piece of silverware, creating a beautiful backdrop for my husband to announce he was leaving me. All that effort, all that care, all that invisible labor to make everyone else comfortable while I became increasingly invisible myself. I must have sat there for 2 hours, watching joggers and dog walkers enjoy their holiday afternoon, before I finally turned my phone back on. 43 missed calls and 67 text messages greeted me, the notifications scrolling down the screen like a waterfall of other people's panic. The first few messages were from Jessica, and despite everything, I felt a flutter of maternal concern as I read them. "Mom, where did you go? Everyone's freaking out here. Dad is acting like nothing happened and trying to get everyone to eat dinner. It's so weird. Seriously, Mom, please just text back so I know you're okay. Then came the messages from Jennifer, my sister, who had apparently appointed herself as the family mediator. Linda, what is happening? Marcus says you just walked out in the middle of dinner. Come back so we can talk about this like adults. The kids are confused and dinner is getting cold. I scrolled through more messages from various family members, each one reflecting their own perspective on what had just transpired. Eleanor, my mother-in-law, had sent several increasingly indignant texts about how scenes were inappropriate at family gatherings. My brother Paul had texted to ask if I needed him to handle Marcus, which would have been touching if Paul had ever successfully handled anything more complex than a beer bottle. But it was the messages from Marcus himself that made me feel something between rage and pity. Linda, we need to talk. Come home. You're embarrassing both of us by running off like this. I know this is a shock, but we can discuss this privately, like mature adults. Your dramatic exit has ruined Thanksgiving for everyone. Mature adults. As if there was a mature way to announce you're leaving your wife in front of 19 family members over the turkey she'd spent 2 days preparing. As if my dramatic exit was somehow more inappropriate than his dramatic announcement. The audacity was breathtaking, but not surprising. This was Marcus's pattern: create chaos, and then criticize others for their reaction to it. Make unilateral decisions, and then demand that everyone else handle them with grace and understanding. I was typing a response when my phone rang. Andrew's name flashed on the screen, and something in my chest loosened slightly. Of our 2 children, Andrew had always been more perceptive about family dynamics, even if he'd never said anything direct about them. Mom? His voice was careful, like he was talking to someone who might bolt at any sudden movement. Are you okay? I'm fine, sweetheart. I'm sitting by the river, watching the sunset. There was a pause. That sounds nice. It's pretty chaotic here. I could hear voices in the background, multiple conversations happening at once, the kind of social confusion that occurs when a family gathering goes spectacularly off script. How is everyone handling things? Andrew let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sigh. Well, Eleanor is holding court in the living room, explaining to anyone who'll listen that marriages go through rough patches and that public displays are unseemly. Jennifer is trying to organize the leftovers while also fielding phone calls from Uncle Paul, who apparently wants to drive over and have a man-to-man with Dad. And your father? Andrew seemed to be choosing his words carefully. He's acting like this was all planned. Like he expected you to leave and now everyone should just carry on with dinner. He's been explaining to people that you've been struggling with the transition for months. The transition. I almost laughed again. What transition was that, exactly? The transition from being a wife who did everything to being a wife who was supposed to gracefully accept being discarded? Mom, can I ask you something? Andrew's voice was quieter now, like he'd moved away from the crowd. Of course. Did you know this was coming? I considered the question seriously. Had I known? There had been signs, certainly. The closed-door phone calls, the new clothes, the sudden interest in personal fitness. The way Marcus had started talking about authenticity and living your truth. Language that had seemed out of character for a man who'd spent 28 years following the most conventional path imaginable. I knew something was different, I said finally, but I think I chose not to examine it too closely. It was easier to stay busy with my lists and preparations than to confront what was really happening. That sucks, Mom. The whole thing just sucks. Yes, I agreed. It does. Are you coming back tonight? I looked out at the river where the last light was reflecting off the water in ribbons of silver and gold. I don't think so. I think I need some space to process all of this. Where will you go? It was a practical question. the kind that Andrew had always been good at asking. Where would I go? I'd been so focused on leaving that I hadn't considered where I was going to. My entire adult life had been built around that house, that marriage, those routines. I had friends, but they were mostly couple friends, shared social connections that would become complicated now. I had my job at the accounting firm downtown, but that was just work, not a life. I'll figure it out, I said, with more confidence than I felt. After we hung up, I drove to the Hampton Inn near the highway, a place I'd passed countless times but never imagined I'd need. The desk clerk was a young woman who looked like she'd drawn the holiday shift and wasn't particularly happy about. I need a room for tonight, I told her. Just tonight? She looked at me skeptically, taking in my Thanksgiving dinner outfit and my lack of luggage. For now, yes. She processed my credit card and handed me a key card. Checkout is at 11. There's a continental breakfast from 6 to 9. My room was on the 3rd floor, with a view of the parking lot and a slice of highway visible between 2 buildings. It was clean and anonymous and nothing like the home I'd left behind, filled with 28 years of accumulated possessions and memories and habits. I sat on the bed and finally allowed myself to feel the full weight of what had happened. My marriage was over. Not just struggling, not just going through a rough patch, but actually definitively over. Marcus hadn't asked for counseling or suggested a trial separation or proposed working on our problems together. He'd made his decision, unilaterally, and announced it publicly, like a CEO presenting quarterly results to shareholders. The strange thing was that underneath the shock and hurt, I felt something that took me a while to identify. Relief. The constant low-level anxiety I'd been carrying for months, the sense that something was wrong but I couldn't quite put my finger on what, had finally been resolved. The other shoe had dropped, and now at least I knew where I stood. My phone rang again. This time it was Jennifer. Linda, thank God. Where are you? We've been worried sick. I'm fine. I'm safe. I just needed some space. This is insane. You can't just walk out in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner. People are talking, Linda. Eleanor is beside herself. I felt a familiar stirring of guilt, the automatic response that had governed so many of my decisions over the years. Other people's comfort, other people's opinions, other people's expectations had always taken precedence over my own feelings. But tonight, the guilt felt different. Smaller somehow and easier to examine. What exactly should I have done differently, Jennifer? Should I have smiled and served dessert after my husband announced he was leaving me? You should have handled it privately. You should have asked to speak with him alone instead of making a scene. I didn't make a scene. Marcus made a scene. I just declined to participate in pretending it was normal. Jennifer was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. Okay, you're right about that. What he did was awful. But Linda, you can't just run away from this. You have to come back and deal with it. Why? The question seemed to catch her off guard. What do you mean, why? Why do I have to come? Back tonight? Why do I have to deal with this according to everyone else's timeline? Why is my response to being blindsided and humiliated somehow more problematic than the blindsiding and humiliation itself? Because... Jennifer seemed to be struggling for an answer. Because that's what adults do. They handle things maturely. There was that word again, maturely. As if there was a mature way to react to having your life blown up without warning. As if the problem was my response rather than the situation itself. I am handling this maturely, I said. I'm removing myself from a hostile environment so I can think clearly about my options. That seems pretty mature to me. After I ended the call with Jennifer, I ordered Chinese food from a place that delivered to the hotel, something I hadn't done in years. At home, I would have been cleaning up the kitchen by now, putting away leftovers, loading the dishwasher, already planning tomorrow's meals. Instead, I ate lo mein straight from the container while watching a mindless romantic comedy on the Yao, hotel cable, feeling like I was playing hooky from my own life. The next few hours brought a steady stream of calls and texts, each person in my family apparently taking a turn at trying to convince me to come home and handle this situation properly. The consensus seemed to be that while Marcus's announcement was tactless, my departure was dramatic and unhelpful, and the mature thing to do would be to return so we could all discuss this like rational adults. The pressure was familiar. Throughout my marriage, whenever Marcus did something thoughtless or hurtful, the focus inevitably shifted to my reaction. If I got upset, I was being emotional. If I tried to discuss it, I was nagging. If I withdrew to collect myself, I was being dramatic. Somehow, his actions were just things that happened, while my responses to his actions were character flaws that needed correction. Around 10 o'clock, Jessica called. "Mom, I just want you to know that I think you're handling this exactly right." Her words were so unexpected that I felt tears prick my eyes for the first time since leaving the house. Really? Really? What Dad did tonight was cruel and cowardly, and everyone else trying to pressure you into coming back and pretending it's all normal is just as bad. Your grandmother thinks I'm being dramatic. Jessica snorted. Grandmother thinks expressing any emotion stronger than mild disappointment is dramatic. She's been criticizing your reaction for the past 3 hours, while completely ignoring the fact that Dad ambushed you in front of the entire family. We talked for another hour, and for the first time in months, I felt heard by one of my children. Jessica, who had seemed so critical and distant lately, turned out to have been observing the family dynamics more clearly than I'd realized. "Mom, can I tell you something?" she said as our conversation was winding down. "Of course." "I've been worried about you for a while now. You've seemed so tired lately, so worn down, like you were disappearing into all the things you were doing for everyone else." Her observation hit me like a physical blow, partly because it was so accurate. I didn't realize it was that obvious. It wasn't obvious to most people, because most people don't really see you. They see what you do for them, but they don't see you as a separate person with your own needs. Including your father? Especially Dad. Her voice was gentle but firm. "Mom, I love him, but he's been treating you like a really efficient personal assistant for years. Tonight was just him making it official." After we hung up, I lay in the hotel bed staring at the ceiling and thinking about what Jessica had said. When had I stopped being Linda and started being just the person who handled everything? When had my identity become so tied up in service that I'd forgotten I was supposed to have wants and needs of my own? I thought about the last time Marcus and I had a real conversation, not about logistics or schedules or family obligations, but about thoughts and feelings and dreams. I couldn't remember. Our interactions had become purely functional. Who was picking up the dry cleaning, what time his parents were arriving, whether we needed to hire someone to clean the gutters. I'd become a manager of our shared life rather than a participant in it. And Marcus had been happy with that arrangement because it freed him to focus on his own interests and pursuits without having to think about the mundane details that kept our household running. But apparently, even that hadn't been enough. Even having a wife who asked for nothing and provided everything hadn't been sufficient to keep him interested in being married to me. The next morning, I woke up disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings and the absence of my usual alarm clock. At home, I would have been up by 6, already planning the day's post-Thanksgiving activities, dealing with leftovers, taking down decorations, writing thank you notes to guests for their participation in the dinner I'd hosted. Instead, I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the highway and feeling the strange luxury of having nowhere I needed to be and nothing I needed to do for anyone else. My phone showed 23 new messages, but I decided they could wait. I took a long shower using the hotel's generic toiletries and then walked to the lobby for the continental breakfast, something I'd never done in my entire adult life. Sitting alone at a small table, eating a bagel and drinking coffee from a disposable cup, I felt like an anthropologist studying the customs of a foreign culture. Other hotel guests moved through the breakfast area with the quiet efficiency of people who traveled regularly, who were comfortable being alone in anonymous spaces. I envied their ease, their obvious familiarity with taking care of themselves without reference to anyone else's needs or schedules. When I finally checked my messages, I found that the family crisis had escalated overnight. Marcus had apparently spent the evening calling various relatives to explain the situation, presenting his version of events in which I'd had an irrational reaction to what was supposed to be a mature conversation about our marital problems. According to the messages I'd received, Marcus's narrative was that we'd been having difficulties for months, that he'd tried to discuss them with me multiple times, and that he'd finally decided to be honest about his feelings in front of the family because he hoped they could help us work through things. My dramatic departure had made it impossible to have the rational discussion he'd been hoping for. It was a masterful rewriting of history, turning his ambush into an attempt at transparency and my shock into irrational behavior. Several family members had apparently bought this version of events and were now messaging me with gentle suggestions that I apologize for overreacting and come home so we could all have a calm discussion about how to move forward. The manipulation was so smooth, so subtle, that I almost found myself wondering if maybe I had overreacted. Maybe walking out had been childish. Maybe I should have stayed and tried to handle things more diplomatically. But then I remembered the feeling of sitting at that perfectly set table, listening to my husband toast his new life without me, while surrounded by the dishes I'd spent days preparing, and the clarity returned. There was no diplomatic way to respond to being discarded publicly. There was no mature way to smile and nod while someone announced they were done with you. I was getting dressed to check out of the hotel when my phone rang. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't expected: Rebecca Martinez, my supervisor at the accounting firm where I'd worked part-time for the past 15 years. "Linda, I hope I'm not calling too early. I heard about what happened yesterday and wanted to check on you." I was surprised by her call, and even more surprised that news of my domestic drama had somehow reached my workplace. "How did you hear about it?" Rebecca laughed dryly. "Small town, Linda. Plus, my husband plays golf with your brother-in-law, Tom. News travels fast." "I'm fine," I said automatically, then corrected myself. "Actually, I'm not fine, but I'm handling it." "Good for you. Listen, I'm calling because I have a proposition for you if you're interested." "What kind of proposition?" "We've been talking about expanding your role here for months, but you've always said you couldn't take on more hours because of family obligations. Well, if your family obligations are about to change significantly, maybe it's time to revisit that conversation." I sank down onto the hotel bed, suddenly grateful for something concrete to focus on. "What are you thinking?" "Full-time office manager position, good salary, benefits, your own office. You already know our systems better than anyone, and frankly, you're overqualified for what we've been having you do. The partners have been impressed with your work for years." The offer was tempting, not just for the financial security it would provide, but for the affirmation that someone valued my skills and wanted to invest in my professional growth. At home, my contributions were expected and largely invisible. At work, apparently, they were noticed and appreciated. Can I think about it? Of course. But Linda, don't think too long. Good opportunities don't wait forever, and neither should you. After we hung up, I sat in the hotel room thinking about Rebecca's words. Good opportunities don't wait forever, and neither should you. How long had I been waiting? How many opportunities had I passed up because they didn't fit with my role as the accommodating wife and mother? I thought about the evening classes I'd wanted to take, the trips I'd wanted to plan, the friendships I'd wanted to develop. All postponed because Marcus needed something, or the kids needed something, or the house needed something. My own desires had always been the lowest priority, the thing that could wait until later, until after everyone else was taken care of. But later had never come. There had always been another holiday to plan, another crisis to manage. another person whose needs took precedence over my own. I checked out of the hotel and drove back toward Millbrook, but instead of going home, I stopped at Cedar Grove Cemetery, where my parents were buried. I hadn't visited their graves in over a year, another item on my endless list of things I meant to do when I had time. Standing in front of their modest headstones, I found myself having a conversation with them I wish I could have had while they were alive. My mother had died when I was 35, just old enough to start questioning some of the choices I'd made, but still young enough to believe I had plenty of time to make changes. My father had passed 5 years later, taking with him any chance. I might have had to ask him whether he'd noticed how small I'd become, how much of myself I'd given away in the service of being good and helpful and accommodating. I think I forgot how to be a person instead of just a function, I said out loud, feeling slightly foolish but also oddly comforted by the ritual of speaking to them. I became so good at anticipating what everyone else needed that I stopped, knowing what I needed myself. The November wind rustled through the bare branches above me, and I imagined it was their way of encouraging me to keep talking. Marcus wants to start over without me, and I think maybe he's right. Not about me being the problem, but about needing to start over. I think I need to start over too, but as myself this time. As Linda, not as Marcus's wife or Jessica and Andrew's, mother or Eleanor's daughter-in-law. I stayed at the cemetery for over an hour, having the kind of honest conversation with my parents that I'd never quite managed when they were alive. When I finally left, I felt clearer about what I needed to do next. Instead of going home, I drove to the public library and spent the afternoon researching divorce law, rental properties, and job opportunities. I opened a new checking account at a bank where Marcus and I didn't have a relationship. I called a locksmith and arranged to have the locks changed on the house while Marcus was at work on Monday. These were practical steps, concrete actions that felt like building blocks for a new life. Each decision I made without consulting anyone else felt like a small revolution, a quiet declaration of independence from the collaborative decision-making that had characterized my marriage. By evening, I had a basic plan. I would stay in the house temporarily while Marcus found somewhere else to live. I would take the full-time position Rebecca had offered. I would file for divorce after the holidays, not to be vindictive, but because I deserved better than being someone's practice run for authenticity. When I finally drove home that evening, I felt like a different person than the one who had left 24 hours earlier. The house looked the same from the outside, but I was viewing it with new eyes. This was my home too, not just the place where I served everyone else's needs. I had as much right to be here as Marcus did, probably more since I was the one who had actually been maintaining it all these years. Marcus's car was in the driveway, and I could see lights on in his study. He was probably crafting his next narrative, preparing his next explanation for why his behavior was reasonable and mine was not. But for the first time in 28 years, I didn't care what story Marcus was telling about me. I had my own story now, and it was just beginning. I walked through the front door of my own house with the deliberate confidence of someone who had finally remembered they belonged there. The familiar scent of yesterday's turkey still lingered in the air, mixed with something else I couldn't quite identify. The smell of ending, perhaps, or the stale aftermath of a celebration that had curdled into something unrecognizable. Marcus emerged from his study almost immediately, as if he'd been watching for my car from the window. He looked haggard, his carefully styled hair disheveled and his expensive sweater wrinkled. For a moment, I felt a flicker of the old sympathy, the automatic urge to smooth things over and make him comfortable. Then I remembered his toast, and the feeling passed. "Linda, thank God you're home. We need to talk." I set my purse down on the hall table and looked at him directly. Really looked at him, maybe for the first time in years. Marcus at 54 was still handsome in a conventional way, with the kind of silver-touched good looks that made people assume he was distinguished and successful. But standing there in our hallway, trying to manage the situation he'd created, he looked smaller somehow. diminished. Yes, I agreed. We do need to talk. His face brightened with what looked like relief. Good. I was hoping you'd be reasonable about this. I know yesterday was a shock, but if we can just discuss things calmly. Where did you want me to go, Marcus? The question stopped him mid-sentence. What? Yesterday, when you toasted your new beginning without me, where exactly did you picture me going? Did you imagine I'd just disappear quietly? Move in with Jennifer? Find a nice little apartment somewhere and fade into the background of your improved life? He shifted uncomfortably, clearly not expecting this line of questioning. I thought we could work out the details together, like adults. There's no reason this has to be ugly or complicated. Ah. I nodded as if he'd just clarified something important. So you were planning to manage my exit the same way you've managed everything else in our marriage. You make the unilateral decision, and I handle all the messy details of implementation. That's not fair, Linda. I've been trying to talk to you about our problems for months. Have you? I moved past him into the living room, where evidence of yesterday's gathering was still scattered around. Empty wine glasses on the coffee table, cushions displaced by guests. The general disorder that follows any large family event. When exactly were these conversations happening? Because I don't remember any discussions about problems. I remember you mentioning that you were feeling restless, that you wanted to make some changes in your life. But I don't remember you ever suggesting that I was one of the problems that needed solving. Marcus followed me, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. I tried to bring up how we'd grown apart, how we wanted different things. You wanted different things, I corrected. You never asked what I wanted. I assumed you were happy with our life. You never complained. The words hung in the air between us, revealing so much about how Marcus saw our marriage. In his mind, my lack of complaints equaled satisfaction. My accommodation equaled contentment. It had never occurred to him that I might have learned not to complain because complaining was futile, or that I might have stopped expressing my own wants because they were consistently dismissed or ignored. Marcus, when was the last time you asked me what I wanted? Not what I thought about your plans or what I needed help with around the house, but what I actually wanted for myself. He opened his mouth to answer, then closed it again. I could see him searching his memory, trying to find a recent example and coming up empty. It's okay, I said, though it wasn't. I'm not asking because I expect an answer. I'm asking because I want you to understand something. I stopped telling you what I wanted years ago because it became clear that my wants were inconvenient obstacles to your plans, not important factors in our shared decisions. That's not true, isn't it? Remember when I wanted to go back to school to finish my degree? You said it would be too expensive and too complicated with the kids' schedules. Remember, when I wanted to take that job at the museum? You said the hours were impractical and the pay wasn't worth the disruption to our family routine. Remember when I wanted to spend our anniversary in Paris? You said it was too extravagant and we should be practical about money. With each example, Marcus's face grew more uncomfortable. These were all conversations we'd had, decisions that had been presented as mutual agreements, but had really been instances of him dismissing my desires in favor of maintaining the status quo that worked best for him. But Linda, those decisions made sense at the time. We had responsibilities, obligations. We had your priorities, I corrected, and I had learned to present my own priorities so softly, so tentatively, that it was easy for you to override them. I trained myself to want only things that were convenient for you to give me. He sat down heavily on the sofa, finally beginning to understand that this conversation wasn't going the way he'd planned. So, what are you saying? That our entire marriage has been a lie? No. I'm saying our entire marriage has been an arrangement, where one person's needs and wants matter more than the others. And yesterday, You made it clear that you found an even better arrangement, one where the other person's needs don't factor in at all. The doorbell rang, interrupting the most honest conversation Marcus and I had probably ever had. Through the front window, I could see Eleanor's distinctive silver sedan in the driveway, and I felt my stomach clench with dread. "Did you call? Your mother?" I asked Marcus. "She called me. She's worried about you. About us." Of course she was. Eleanor had always positioned herself as the guardian of family propriety, the one who ensured that unpleasant realities were handled with appropriate discretion. My public departure from Thanksgiving dinner would have violated every principle of her carefully maintained social order. I opened the door to find Eleanor standing on my front porch with the rigid posture of a general preparing to restore order to a chaotic battlefield. She was dressed in what I'd come to think of as her crisis management outfit, a tailored navy suit that conveyed both authority and respectability. "Linda, dear." Her voice was warm but controlled, the tone she used when she was about to deliver criticism disguised as concern. "I'm so glad you're home. We were all so worried." "Were you?" I stepped aside to let her in, genuinely curious about what Eleanor's version of worry looked like. Of course we were. Running off like that, in the middle of a family gathering, it wasn't like you at all. "You're right," I agreed. "It wasn't like me. The old me would have stayed and smiled and pretended that everything was normal while dying inside. But apparently, I'm not that person anymore." Eleanor's carefully composed expression flickered slightly. She wasn't used to directness from me, accustomed as she was to my usual diplomatic responses and eager accommodation. "Linda, I understand. You're upset. What Marcus did yesterday was tactless, I'll grant you that. But surely you can see that making a scene in front of the entire family wasn't the appropriate response." "What would have been the appropriate response, Eleanor? Should I have thanked him for his honesty? Offered to help him pack? You should have maintained your dignity and handled the matter privately." I felt something snap inside me, a thread of tolerance that had been stretched too thin for too long. My dignity. "Eleanor?" My husband stood up in front of our entire family and announced that his new life required my absence. He did this after I had spent a week preparing a meal for 19 people, after I had orchestrated every detail of a gathering designed to celebrate family and gratitude. And you think the problem is that I didn't handle his humiliation of me with sufficient dignity? "I think," Eleanor said, her voice growing cooler, "that a wife who truly cared about her husband's happiness would want to discuss his concerns rather than running away from them." The words hit me like a slap, partly because they were so perfectly calibrated to trigger my guilt, and partly because they revealed how Eleanor really saw me. In her worldview, my role was to absorb whatever treatment Marcus chose to dish out and respond with understanding and accommodation. My pain was less important than his comfort, my humiliation less significant than his convenience. "You're right," I said, and watched Eleanor's face brighten with satisfaction. A wife who truly cared about her husband's happiness would probably react exactly the way you're describing. But Eleanor, I've spent 28 years being that wife, and it turns out that level of care and accommodation still wasn't enough to keep Marcus interested in being married to me. So I've decided to try caring about my own happiness for a change. Eleanor's mouth opened and closed without producing sound, like a fish suddenly finding itself out of water. "And frankly," I continued, feeling a momentum I'd never experienced before, "I'm tired of being lectured about appropriate responses by people who think it's appropriate for a man to blindside his wife with divorce announcements over Thanksgiving dinner." "Linda." Marcus's voice carried a warning tone I'd heard countless times before, the subtle signal that I was approaching the boundaries of acceptable behavior and needed to rein myself in. But this time, instead of automatically moderating my tone and backing down, I turned to face him fully. "No, Marcus. I'm done pretending that other people's comfort is more important than my right to honest communication and basic respect." Eleanor looked between us with growing alarm, clearly recognizing that the family dynamic she'd helped establish and maintain was shifting in ways she couldn't control. "Well," she said, gathering her purse with the sharp movements of someone who'd been deeply offended, "I can see that emotions are running too high for productive conversation. Marcus, perhaps you should stay somewhere else tonight while Linda has time to think about whether she really wants to throw away 30 years of marriage over a moment of poor judgment." 28 years, I corrected automatically. And, Eleanor, the poor judgment wasn't mine. After she left, Marcus and I sat in the living room surrounded by the remnants of yesterday's celebration, both of us seemingly unsure how to proceed. The rules that had governed our interactions for decades had been suspended, leaving us without a familiar script to follow. "You've never talked to my mother like that before," Marcus said finally. "No, I haven't. I've never talked to anyone like that before. It was pretty brutal. I considered this. Was it? Or was it just honest? Because I've been polite and diplomatic and accommodating for so long that basic honesty feels brutal in comparison." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was different. Less confident, more uncertain. "Linda, I don't think I realized how angry you were." "I wasn't angry, Marcus. I was disappearing. Anger would have been healthier, actually, because anger implies that you think you deserve better treatment. I had moved past anger into a kind of resigned acceptance that this was just how marriage worked, how life worked. And now, I'm angry. But it's clean anger, purposeful anger. The kind that helps you see clearly instead of the kind that makes you want to hurt people." He looked up at me then, really looked, and I saw something in his face I hadn't seen in years. Actual curiosity about who I was and what I was thinking. "What do you want, Linda? Right now, in this moment, what do you actually want?" The question was so unexpected, so unprecedented, that I almost didn't know how to answer it. When was the last time someone had asked me what I wanted without following it immediately with reasons why that want was impractical or inconvenient? "I want you to leave," I said, surprising myself with how quickly and clearly the answer came. "Not forever, necessarily, but right now. I want space to think without having to manage your feelings about my thinking. I want to wake up tomorrow morning and make decisions based on what's best for me instead of what's easiest for everyone else." Marcus nodded slowly, as if he was processing information that required significant mental adjustment. "For how long?" "I don't know. As long as it takes for me to figure out who I am when I'm not constantly accommodating someone else's needs and preferences. And then we'll see. Maybe we can build something new together, something more honest and equitable. Or maybe we'll discover that we're just not compatible when I'm not doing all the emotional and practical labor that's been keeping us together." That evening, after Marcus had packed a bag and left for his brother's house, I walked through my home with a strange sense of rediscovering territory I'd forgotten belonged to me. Without the constant background noise of someone else's presence and expectations, the house felt different. Not empty, but spacious in a way I hadn't experienced in decades. I made myself a simple dinner and ate it at the kitchen counter while reading a novel I'd started months ago but never had time to finish. I took a long bath without worrying about using up all the hot water. I watched a movie Marcus would have found boring and fell asleep on the sofa without anyone commenting on the impracticality of sleeping anywhere but bed. Small freedoms, but they felt revolutionary after so many years of collaborative decision-making that wasn't actually collaborative. The next morning, I called Rebecca and accepted the full-time position she'd offered. Then I called a lawyer, whose name Jessica had given me, a woman who specialized in divorce cases and had a reputation for protecting women's interests without creating unnecessary drama. "I want to be fair," I told Sarah Chen during our initial consultation. "But I also want to make sure I'm not signing away my future out of habit." Sarah was younger than me, probably Jessica's age, with the kind of confident directness I was learning to admire. "Tell me about the marriage. Who worked? Who managed the household? Who made the major decisions?" As I described the past 28 years, Marcus's career advancement, my part-time work, my management of all domestic responsibilities, our patterns of decision-making, I saw our relationship through professional eyes for the first time. Sarah took notes without comment, but I could see her building a case in her mind. "Linda, what you're describing is a marriage where one party provided significant unpaid labor that enabled the other party's career advancement and wealth accumulation. Even though your name isn't on some of the accounts, you have legitimate claims to assets that were built with your contributions." I don't want to be vindictive. Asking for your fair share isn't vindictive. It's practical. You've spent nearly 3 decades investing in a partnership that's now being dissolved. You deserve to be compensated for that investment. Over the following weeks, a new routine emerged. I went to work each day at the accounting firm, where my expanded responsibilities required me to make decisions and solve problems independently. I came home to a house that stayed exactly as I left it, ate meals I chose without consulting anyone else's preferences, and went to bed when I was tired, rather than when it was socially appropriate. Marcus called regularly, conversations that were awkward but necessary as we worked through the practical details of separating a shared life. He was staying with his brother temporarily, but looking for his own apartment. He seemed genuinely surprised by how much there was to untangle. Bank accounts, insurance policies, social obligations, the accumulated infrastructure of nearly 3 decades together. "I never realized how much you handled," he admitted during one of these calls. "Tom's wife has been helping me figure out things like health insurance and bill paying, and it's incredibly complicated." I almost offered to help him navigate these complexities, the old instinct to smooth his path rising automatically. But I caught myself and simply said, "Yes, it is complicated. I'm sure you'll figure it out." The holidays passed quietly. I declined several invitations to family gatherings, choosing instead to volunteer at the community soup kitchen on Christmas Eve and spend Christmas Day reading and cooking a simple meal for myself. It was the first Christmas in decades that I didn't spend weeks planning and executing celebrations for other people, and the piece of it was almost shocking. Eleanor called on New Year's Eve to inform me that Marcus was bringing a date to her annual New Year's party, just so you know, in case you were planning to attend. The date, she mentioned with careful casualness, was someone from his office, a younger woman who apparently understood that modern relationships required more flexibility and open-mindedness than my generation seemed capable of. "Are you trying to make me jealous, Eleanor?" I asked, genuinely curious about her strategy. "I'm trying to help you understand that good men don't stay available forever, Linda. If you're serious about saving your marriage, you might want to consider whether your pride is worth losing Marcus to someone who appreciates what he has to offer." After I hung up, I sat in my quiet living room thinking about Eleanor's words. Was I proud? Yes, I supposed I was. Proud of learning to value myself. Proud of refusing to accept treatment that diminished my worth. Proud of choosing temporary loneliness over permanent invisibility. As for losing Marcus to someone who appreciated what he had to offer, well, that assumed I still wanted what Marcus had to offer, which was no longer a given. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a restlessness I hadn't felt in decades. I enrolled in a photography class, something I'd always wanted to try but had never had time for. I planned a trip to Ireland, a destination that had been on my someday list for 20 years. I started going to a book club where my opinions about literature mattered more than my ability to provide snacks for the group. Marcus and I had been separated for 6 months when he asked if we could meet for dinner to discuss our situation. He'd been seeing the woman from his office, he told me, but it wasn't serious. He'd been doing some thinking, some therapy, and he'd come to understand that he'd taken me for granted in ways he was only beginning to recognize. "I want to try again." he said over appetizers at a restaurant we'd never been to together. I know I hurt you, and I know I have a lot to make up for. But Linda, we have history together. We have children together. Doesn't that count for something? I looked across the table at this man I'd been married to for most of my adult life, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Fondness mixed with sadness. Marcus wasn't a villain exactly. He was a man who had been raised to expect certain services from women and had found a woman willing to provide them. The system had worked beautifully for him, so he'd never questioned it. It counts for a lot, I said honestly. But Marcus, the version of me that you want to try again with doesn't exist anymore. I'm not willing to go back to a marriage where my needs are secondary to yours, where my contributions are invisible, where I'm valued primarily for what I can do for you rather than who I am as a person. Things would be different this time. I understand now what I was doing wrong. Do you? Because even tonight, your proposal is about what you want and what you've learned and what you're willing to offer. You haven't asked me what I want, or what I've learned, or what would make me happy. He paused, looking genuinely thoughtful for the first time in the conversation. What would make you happy, Linda? I don't know yet, I admitted. I'm still figuring that out. But I know it's not rebuilding a marriage based on the same foundation that collapsed the first time. We finished dinner with a melancholy politeness. Two people who had shared decades of history, but no longer shared a vision of the future. Marcus walked me to my car, and for a moment, we stood in the parking lot like teenagers at the end of an awkward first date. I'm sorry, he said finally. For all of it. For not seeing you. For not valuing what you gave me. For humiliating you in front of our family. You deserved better. Yes, I agreed. I did. But Marcus, I also deserved to ask for better instead of just hoping you'd eventually notice what was missing. We both made mistakes, but only one of us is interested in making different ones going forward. The divorce was finalized on a rainy Tuesday in October, almost a year after that Thanksgiving. Dinner that had changed everything. I signed papers in Sarah's office while Marcus signed identical papers in his lawyer's office across town. And just like that, 28 years of marriage became a legal document that divided assets and outlined custody arrangements for adult children who didn't need custody arrangements. How do you feel? Sarah asked as we gathered up the paperwork. Free, I said, and realized I meant it. Scared, but free. That evening, I called Jessica and Andrew to let them know the divorce was final. Both conversations were difficult but necessary. Two young adults trying to process the end of the only family structure they'd ever known. Are you okay, Mom? Andrew asked, his voice carrying the same careful concern it had held since Thanksgiving a year ago. I'm more than okay, I told him. I'm discovering who I am when I'm not spending all my energy trying to be what other people need me to be. And who are you? It was a good question, one I was still answering. I'm someone who likes quiet mornings and spontaneous travel plans. I'm someone who reads poetry and takes photographs of things that interest me, rather than things that will look good in Christmas cards. I'm someone who says no when people ask me to do things I don't want to do. And yes, when they ask me to do things that excite me. You sound different, he observed. Stronger, maybe. I feel different. I feel like myself for the first time in decades. 2 years later, I was sitting in a cafe in Dublin, editing photographs from my morning walk along the coast, when my phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. He was getting married again, he wrote, to the woman from his office, and he wanted me to know before I heard it from someone else. I typed back a sincere congratulations and meant it. Marcus deserved to be happy, and more importantly, he deserved to be with someone who wanted the same kind of marriage he wanted. I hoped this time he'd found a true partner rather than another accommodating woman who would eventually disappear into her service to his needs. As for me, I was discovering that happiness looked different than I'd expected. It wasn't about finding someone new to build a life with, though I wasn't opposed to that possibility. It was about building a life that belonged entirely to me, filled with choices that reflected my actual preferences rather than my trained responses to other people's expectations. I thought about the woman I'd been 2 years ago, standing in that beautiful dining room surrounded by the perfect Thanksgiving dinner she'd orchestrated, listening to her husband announce his exit from their shared life. That woman had been so focused on creating beauty and comfort for others that she'd forgotten to create any for herself. The woman I'd become was still capable of creating beauty and comfort, but now she did it selectively, intentionally, for people who valued both, the effort and the person making it. She traveled alone without apologizing for taking up space. She expressed opinions without softening them for easier consumption. She asked for what she wanted instead of hoping someone would guess. She was, in short, finally visible. To others, but more importantly, to herself. My phone buzzed again with a message from Eleanor, who had maintained sporadic contact since the divorce, despite her obvious disapproval of my choices. "I hear Marcus is getting married again," she wrote. "I hope you're not too upset by the news." I looked out the cafe window at the Irish Sea, gray and endless under an overcast sky, and typed back, "I'm happy for him. We both deserved better than what we had together." Eleanor didn't respond, probably unable to process the idea that the dissolution of a marriage could be a positive outcome for everyone involved. In her worldview, wives who lost their husbands had failed, regardless of the circumstances that led to the loss. But I hadn't lost anything that was actually mine to begin with. I'd simply stopped pretending that serving someone else's vision of my life was the same thing as living my own life. The cafe owner, a woman about my age with silver hair and laugh lines around her eyes, stopped by my table to refill my coffee cup. "American?" she asked, having heard me answer my phone earlier. "Yes, from New York." "Traveling alone?" "By choice," I said, and smiled at how easily the words came now. She smiled back with the recognition of one independent woman acknowledging another. "Best way to travel, that. You see what you want to see, go where you want to go, no compromises." "Exactly." After she moved on to other customers, I returned to my photographs, selecting the ones that captured something true about this place and this moment. There was one shot of an elderly man walking his dog along the shoreline, both of them moving with the unhurried pace of beings who had nowhere else they needed to be. Another of a young woman reading on a park bench, completely absorbed in her book, oblivious to the world around her. Pictures of people living their own lives, making their own choices, occupying their own space in the world without apology or explanation. I saved the photographs to my laptop and started a new email to Jessica and Andrew, attaching the images and writing about my travels, my discoveries, my growing comfort with being exactly who I was instead of who I thought I should be. "I know it's been hard for you both to understand why I couldn't just work things out with your father," I wrote. "But I hope someday you'll understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to stop enabling them to treat you badly. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to stop accepting treatment that makes you disappear." I sent the email and closed my laptop, finished my coffee, and walked out into the Dublin afternoon with no particular destination in mind and all the time in the world to get there. Somewhere across an ocean, Marcus was probably planning another wedding, and I genuinely hoped this one would be happier for everyone involved. Eleanor was probably planning another family gathering, carefully managing the social dynamics to maintain her preferred version of reality. Jessica and Andrew were probably building their own adult lives, making their own mistakes and discoveries. And I was walking through a foreign city with a camera around my neck and a mind full of possibilities, finally living a life that belonged entirely to me. It had taken 54 years and a public humiliation to get here, but I'd arrived at the place I'd been trying to reach without knowing it. A life where I was visible, valuable, and utterly, completely myself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.